Chicago, Illinois, 1889. A much-loved doctor goes out to help an injured man and disappears. While friends frantically search for clues, a secret organization that supports Irish independence becomes public knowledge. The rumors start. Was the man dedicated to the freedom of his homeland, or was he a British spy? It's the history of murder, and I'm your host, Clare O'Donoghue. On May 4th, 1889, a man came to the home of 42-year-old Dr. Patrick Cronin and asked for help. According to Gillian O'Brien, the author of Blood Runs Green, The Murder That Transfixed Gilded Age Chicago, Cronin was working at his home clinic, with patients still waiting to see him, when the man interrupted.
It's an emergency. There's been an accident at an ice house up in Lakeview, north of the city, and that a man has been badly injured and they need a doctor, and he's kept the carriage outside, and could Cronin go and assist? And so Cronin does.
Before we continue, please remember to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to our channel. It will help us continue to make new content. Now, back to the story.
Cronin lived with a married couple, Theo and Cordelia Conklin, who were his landlords and friends. They grew worried when he didn't return.
They call other friends of his, and they also then call the police and say, he's not returned home. This is very suspicious. It's also massively out of character. The police say, well, look, he's an unmarried man. He can do what he likes. He's allowed not return home.
For weeks, the friends searched. They went to the police repeatedly. They went to the newspapers. They made it an international story, but the papers and the public turned it into something else.
There are all sorts of kind of rumors that he had been performing illegal abortions. It had gone wrong. He'd had to run away. He'd been having an affair with a married woman, and her husband had found out, so he had to skip town. All sorts of rumors go spin around, and his supporters say none of these are true. This is entirely out of character. He'd never have done this. They start pointing fingers, but they don't have any evidence either. And after about 2 weeks, the police officer that had been dealing with them basically stands outside the police station and says, and there are some journalists there because Cronin had friends who were journalists, so they had covered his disappearance. And he says, look, boys, I give up. We've looked for him. We can't find him. He can do what he likes.
Patrick Henry Cronin wasn't a celebrity, an elected official, or a Gilded Age industrialist. So why did his life and his disappearance make the headlines?
He's born in Ireland. He's born in a place called Brereton in County Cork. He's born at the height of the famine, so 1847, and then the family leave and they end up in Canada. So that's pretty much where he and his siblings grow up.
He was a baby when the family emigrated to Ontario. As he grew up, he moved to the United States, first to Pennsylvania, then St. Louis, working a variety of jobs. But he had one dream: to be a doctor.
He's sort of finding his feet in terms of what he's going to do, and eventually he gets sort of sponsorship by one of his employers to essentially train to be a doctor.
Cronin set up a medical practice in St. Louis, but he didn't stay long.
He gets a job in a hospital in Chicago, which then brings him to Chicago. He doesn't stay in the hospital that long and sets himself up in his own kind of private practice in the city.
In his practice, he became well known, particularly in the Irish community, because he was a good doctor and, by all accounts, a good person.
If you don't have the money, he'll still treat you. And he was always, and this comes back to bite him, he was always willing to go out if there was a patient sick that he had to go and see.
He also became well known in the community for another quality: his deep tenor singing voice.
He seems to be very well liked and is often called upon, to open events singing or close events singing. Now, not formal events, but, nights in the pub and various things like that.
His medical practice was thriving and he had many friends, but in some ways, he kept himself apart.
He never marries. There's no record of sort of any particular association with any particular woman.
When he arrived in Chicago, Cronin got involved in Irish communities, many of which were formed around Irish independence. Ireland had been under British rule since the 12th century, and a rising movement in Ireland and around the world was dedicated to turning Ireland into an independent republic. A group called the Fenians called for an armed revolution.
They are primarily set up in the United States. They have an Irish wing, which is called the IRB, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And quite quickly they split over how they want to achieve Irish freedom. And out of that, you get Clan na Gael.
The main goal of Clan na Gael, or Family of the Irish, was to use force to get Irish independence from the British. And the center of Clan na Gael was Chicago.
They raise quite a lot of money, and the plan is to use that in some way to achieve freedom. Now, the way that the leader of the clan in Chicago, a sort of charismatic lawyer called Alexander Sullivan, the way he wants to do it in the mid-1880s is to train young men in Chicago and send them to Britain armed with explosives, because a lot of young men in Chicago have explosive training. You know, if they're laying rail tracks or whatever, send them off and have them set off bombs at various targets, particularly in London. You know, they want to target things like Scotland Yard or the London Bridge. They want to target the tube stations.
But there was another plan, more popular with the Irish in Ireland and Britain.
In Ireland and in Britain, there is a real emphasis on the Home Rule movement. And the Home Rule movement is much more constitutional. And it's about getting a parliament for Ireland, if not necessarily a republic. But that would be a big achievement. If you could get a parliament back, you know, it's a step to create further freedom. And in the mid-1880s, that seems like that's actually a viable possibility, more than it had ever been before. And so quite a lot of people in America, a lot of people connected to the Irish debate in America, a lot of those think, well, actually, we shouldn't. Maybe this isn't the time to have bombs. Maybe we'll let the constitutional route play out.
One of those people was Patrick Henry Cronin.
Cronin is leading the group that are saying, actually, we don't think this is a good idea. We think we should let Home Rule, see where that gets us. And if necessary, after that, if it doesn't work, then we should do physical force. Whereas they argued that they were just damaging the cause of Ireland by having bombs going off at the same time as negotiations. But Alexander Sullivan is firmly opposed to that. He wants to use bombs, and he wants to use bombs now.
So the Chicago branch of Clan na Gael focuses on that plan.
It is very much being led by Alexander Sullivan in Chicago. And the men that they're training are being trained in America and being sent over. So it's not that they are sending over ammunition or funds for people on the ground to do it. They're actually sending these men over who, you know, pre-trained in order to set off these bombs. They do that. They're not terribly successful because there are spies and informers. So in most cases, they're intercepted before they get to set the bombs, or in one or two cases, they do explode, but they don't have that devastating impact that Sullivan and other supporters of his had hoped. But they do, you know, upset sort of negotiations around Home Rule.
42-year-old Sullivan was on the executive board of Clan na Gael, and he was a powerful force in the organization.
He's a fascinating character. He was born in Ontario, but comes of Irish lineage. And he, a bit like a load of other men, a bit like the Cronin story, he wends his way. He ends up in Detroit first as an adult. He owns a shoe shop. He's always in scrapes. He owns a shoe shop. That shoe shop goes on fire at a point when he owes a lot of money. He makes a claim on the insurance, and then he has to disappear from Detroit. And he ends up in Chicago, where he reinvents himself as a lawyer. He gets himself into hot water quite quickly in Chicago because he shoots and kills a man.
The man he killed was a high school principal named Francis Hanford, who had written an anonymous letter accusing Sullivan's wife, Margaret Sullivan, of using her influence to have her husband appointed to the Board of Education. On August 7, 1878, Sullivan confronted Hanford, who he had not met before.
My name is Sullivan. I am informed you are the author of a communication read in the Common Council this afternoon, which makes an attack infamous in its nature upon the character of my wife.
Hanford didn't deny writing the letter, but he also didn't confirm it. The two men got into a fistfight, and Sullivan, who was known to carry a pistol, shot Hanford. He later claimed self-defense.
There are 2 trials. He's acquitted both times of that, and he continues to operate as a lawyer. At the same time, he is very much a mover and shaker in Irish American society. He knows everyone. He's heavily involved in Clan Gael. He's making a lot of money. They have a house on Oak Street, which now and then was a very swanky address to have in Chicago.
Margaret Frances Sullivan, who had married Alexander during his days in Detroit, was a well-known journalist. The Catholic World said of her, quote, "She was ranked not with the distinguished women of the press, but with the ablest men," unquote. She had been born in Ireland, and she and her family moved to the U.S. as a child.
She is in many ways kind of better regarded. Certainly history has been kinder to her than it has to him. I think she is more morally committed in many ways to the cause. I think he's somebody who any cause might have captured his attention, and particularly if it could end up being lucrative for him.
Irish independence is the stated reason for the Sullivans and Patrick Cronin's involvement in Clan Gael. But there were nearly 2 million Irish immigrants to America by 1890, and for those who joined the organization, there were other reasons besides Irish independence that reflected their new lives.
It's sort of the equivalent of an Irish version of the Freemasons. And in fact, to join, you go through all these sort of secret oaths and handshakes and all these rituals. It's very, very Freemasonry. And there are jobs there. That's where, if you're a carpenter, you'll get a job. It's also where you'll meet people from home, and they have their meetings, but then they go to the local pubs, and then it becomes a social life. It also becomes part of a community. They organise these picnics around St. Patrick's Day, around other festivities, where there are games and sports, and families go along. And I think, that's great. They can sing a few rebel songs, but I don't think it's any more than, feeling that Ireland is great, and they are fond and have fond thoughts of home. I mean, one of the interesting things I always think about the Irish as immigrants or immigrants into America is they spend all of their time talking about going home, but they don't go home. So I think it's that idea of home and the development of what is quite a different identity. An Irish American identity is quite a different, it's an identity in itself. And I think a lot of them are adapting to that sort of new world.
Cronin had gotten involved in the organization because he wanted to connect with his Irish heritage, but he also wanted to work beside Sullivan, who had become a national figure in Irish American circles.
They're not in the same direct camp. Each of the clan was divided into separate camps, so a certain number of people will be in each camp. Again, it's part of that sort of Freemasonry secrecy thing. You're not supposed to know, except at the very high levels, who else is in different groups.
Aside from clashing on the methods of Irish independence, with Sullivan wanting force and Cronin siding with those who were looking for a political solution, the two men didn't seem to have an issue with each other until 1885.
It becomes apparent that $100,000 has disappeared and gone missing and cannot be accounted for. So Cronin discovers this and starts to make waves within the camps of saying, where is this money? We need a paper trail. We need him to be accountable. And Sullivan's reaction to that is to basically say, well, Cronin is a spy. Because that's the worst thing you could say about someone in an Irish Republican organization.
Sullivan was on record about how he saw spies in his organization.
The informer is foredoomed. No man can betray and live. No hole too dark, no corner of the earth too obscure, or too far to hide the spy and the informer from the avenging arm of the Irish nationality.
Cronin denied this vehemently. He made clear he was not a spy for the British. He pointed to Sullivan as the thief, trying to distract. But Sullivan was the head of the group. And Cronin? He suspiciously had moved around the country a lot, had few personal ties, and once in Chicago, ingratiated himself into the group. There were many with questions about where his loyalties really lay. Cronin was put on a kind of trial at Clan Gael, and the trial was run by Alexander Sullivan. Among the members on Sullivan's side was a Frenchman, Henry Carron, who joined the group, saying his mother was Irish.
And they let him join because they like him. He's apparently good company. And he becomes very friendly with Alexander Sullivan. I think they're in many ways birds of a feather, these sort of weird notions of grandeur that both of them have. So by the time they get to trying Cronin and throwing him out, Le Caron is very much on the throwing him out part.
Another Sullivan supporter carried even more weight. Father Morris Dorney, who had a parish in the stockyards of Chicago, serving the working people there.
He's a priest there, hugely active as a community kind of activist, but is also a very strong Irish nationalist and very close to Alexander Sullivan. He's an interesting character because he is so popular with the people in his parish, because he does a huge amount of good work there, does possibly less good work more broadly. But if you were one of his parishioners, you definitely would have liked Morris Dorney.
Though Cronin did have his allies in the organization, in the end, most sided with Sullivan, and Cronin was expelled.
And so by expelling Cronin, they think the problem will have gone away, that he will now be quiet. But obviously he isn't quiet after he's expelled. And sort of, why would he be? He doesn't really have anything to lose. It also puts pay to the idea that he'd be a spy, because if you're a spy, you don't accuse the person in charge of embezzlement and get thrown out. If you're a spy, you're very quiet, minding your own business. You're not attracting attention to yourself.
Cronin did not go quietly.
He doesn't shut up. He continues to sort of pick away at anyone who listened to him. He will say that Sullivan is corrupt, that he's stolen all this money, that he's very much out for himself. He's not interested in the cause, because Cronin is very much putting front and center that he is loyal to the cause. And eventually someone decides that can't continue because it's damaging the clan in Chicago.
Members associated with Sullivan began looking into Cronin's past, even going up to Canada to look into his childhood there.
They start to try and find some dirt on him. Nothing turns up. There isn't really anything. There's no sort of scandal associated with him. I guess, Sullivan might have thought, well, I have a murder in my background, in fact, or an arson in my background. So maybe there's something we can dig on him. There wasn't anything. Doesn't seem to have been anything that they came with. And so obviously they decide, or somebody decides, that they will have to go down another route and silence him in a much more permanent fashion.
Cronin was fully aware that his life was in danger, but he pressed on, even pushing for Sullivan to go through the same trial at Clan Gael that he did, except that one would be about the missing money. Cronin told a friend he knew what he was risking by pushing the issue of Sullivan's guilt.
I will do my duty. I am alone, a single man, have no wife or children to feed, and consequently do not fear to die. No one will be injured by my death. I will do my duty fearlessly, come what may.
In 1888, Cronin's push to look into the missing money worked. Sullivan was tried for embezzlement by the National Group in New York.
The money is gone, we do know that, but he says it went because of investments. So he says he went to the Chicago Board of Trade, bought stocks, shares, and that they just lost their value, which is possible, but there's no paper trail. And he has, as I said, that big house. But it's not that he says you can come and look at all my business accounts. He says the money doesn't exist because I invested it and the investment went wrong. And so they say, well, okay, that's fair enough. These things happen.
One thing that no one at the trial asked about was how he could afford his lifestyle, such as the elegant house on Oak Street.
It's a suspiciously good house for a journalist and a lawyer who isn't doing that much lawyering.
Sullivan was found not guilty at the trial, but Cronin didn't stop. And the more Cronin talked about Sullivan, the backlash actually hit Cronin more, because he was also talking publicly about Clan Gael.
That's sort of frowned upon quite broadly, just because people like being in a secret society. And then when you shine a light on any of the secret societies, and you have the funny handshakes and you have the weird things, they just look silly. And it's okay when you're doing it, but when it's talked about, it just seems slightly ridiculous.
Cronin became hypervigilant. Some would say paranoid. In April of 1888, a man with a criminal background came to Cronin and told him that he'd been offered $50 by a policeman to beat Cronin up. The man had refused because Cronin had treated his elderly mother, and now the man was coming to warn the doctor. Cronin also told his friends that he'd been called to emergencies, which turned out to be men trying to hurt him, but he had escaped.
At one point, he writes a sort of fictional essay about the harassment, and in it, it's a sort of fictionalized conversation that Cronin has with another person.
Reporter, it strikes me that your funeral would be a very largely attended one. Doctor, yes, and the cause of death very extensively inquired into.
And at the end of that, he says that he might be killed and that his death would be greatly investigated, which is a very peculiar thing to do if you're not afraid that something might happen to you.
Shortly after Sullivan had been exonerated by Clan na Gael, another scandal broke. A member of the Chicago chapter, Henry Lacoran, admitted in a British judicial commission that he was actually an Englishman named Thomas Miller Beach, and he had been spying in Clan na Gael. It was the reason why the men sent over with bombs had been so easily discovered. Though it might have been assumed that this would put pressure on Sullivan to step down because the men were close friends, it didn't. Rumors circulated that Lacoran, aka Thomas Beach, had named Cronin as another spy within the organization. In the spring of 1889, Cronin was approached by Patrick O'Sullivan, no relation to Alexander. He asked Sullivan to serve as an on-call doctor for his employees at the O'Sullivan Ice House, where they would cut, store, and transport ice in the days before refrigerators. One odd thing about the request: the company was in Lakeview.
And there are at least 10 doctors between Cronin and O'Sullivan's business. So why would you, if you want an emergency doctor, you would think you would get the emergency doctor contract to be the one closest to you.
Despite his increasing safety concern, Cronin agreed. They settled on a stipend of $8 a month, just over $300 today.
They had a mutual friend, and I don't think the mutual friend was compromised in this. It doesn't ever seem to be the case. I think they did have a mutual friend, and so he clearly thought, well, this is okay. If we have a mutual friend, then this seems like a legitimate thing.
Cronin told O'Sullivan he'd only go if the person asking for help gave him a business card from the company. O'Sullivan agreed. On May 4th of that year, Cronin got a visitor.
He has a surgery in his home clinic, and he's coming close to the end of the day, and while there are still patients waiting for him, a man arrives in a carriage.
The man showed him the O'Sullivan Ice House business card, said there had been an accident, and a worker was badly injured. Cronin agreed to go. Witnesses would later say they saw Cronin get into a carriage driven by a white horse and speed away. When he didn't return home that night or the next day, his friend and landlord, Theo Conklin, went to O'Sullivan asking about what some patients had overheard about the accident at the ice house. O'Sullivan swore he knew nothing about it. There had been no one injured, and he hadn't sent anyone to summon Cronin to Lakeview. The Conklins then went to the police, and an officer, Dan Coughlin, agreed to investigate. Coughlin followed up on the eyewitness accounts of the carriage driven by the white horse, but said he found nothing. A woman named Anne Murphy said she saw Cronin getting into a streetcar on the night of May 4th, hours after he was alleged to have disappeared. Then there were other sightings in New York. A reporter in Toronto published a story that he spoke to Cronin on May 10th, nearly a week after his disappearance. And then the rumors about what exactly he might have been up to began circulating. For Cronin's friend Theo, it was incredibly frustrating.
Dr. Cronin was one of the more moral men I ever knew. He was not a society man and had no lady friends. He never associated with any woman of ill repute. I know there is no woman in the case, and I know that any insinuations to the effect that the doctor is on a spree must come from those who do not know him as well as I do. You can rest assured, the man was murdered.
Coughlin didn't seem to be taking Theo and Cordelia's concerns seriously, even as the evidence piled up.
They find a trunk which has been dumped in a kind of a ditch. His friends say there seemed to be bloody cotton wool or wool in it. They also found other pieces, and there's reports of carriages going really quickly through Lakeview at night. There's reports of carriages turning up to the lake and possibly dumping something there. The suspicion is that the plan was to take a body and drop it out in the middle of the lake, at which point it would probably never return. There are all sorts of kind of rumors around that, but none of it really sticks. And you can see why it wouldn't, because it's all quite outlandish and there's no evidence of anything.
Though the evidence led nowhere, it did have one positive effect.
What it does do is it keeps the newspapers interested, because they've got something to report, even if it's not anything significant. But it does mean and explain why there were reporters willing to listen to the police officer Coughlin when he said, we're not going to look anymore.
And then, on May 22nd, there was a break in the case.
Within 24 hours of the police saying, there's nothing to see here, some workmen who are responding to a call saying there's a smell in the sewers, and they go and they lift off the cap of the sewer, and they think what they see is a body of a dog down in the sewer.
It wasn't a dog. It was a man, naked except for a scapular. That's a religious object made up of small pieces of cloth, often worn around the neck, to signify devotion in mainly the Catholic faith.
At that point, people go, well, it has to be a Catholic. It has to be he's been murdered by Catholics, because only Catholics would be afraid to remove the religious token.
The dead man was almost instantly identified as Patrick Cronin. It made liars out of everyone who claimed to have seen or talked to him in the weeks since he disappeared. Before anyone could get over the shock of where he was found, a man was arrested for his murder. And his identity was even more outrageous.
The very first person that's arrested and accused of the murder is Daniel Coughlin, who was the police officer in charge of looking for him. So if you're a journalist, that's the gold bit that you're looking for. So that the police officer sent off to find him is actually the person who's suspected of having murdered him.
Coughlin, as it turned out, was an associate of Cronin's enemy at Clan Nagale.
He was a member of the same clan camp as Alexander Sullivan.
The police and public immediately turned their attention on Alexander Sullivan.
He is arrested. He's not charged, or at least he's taken in for questioning, as is the Iceman, Patrick O'Sullivan, Daniel Coughlin, Martin Burke, who's the guy who's suspected of having the horse and cart, John Beggs, who's a lawyer, and a guy called John Coons, who is the guy who's probably not involved, but he looks like someone else who was involved.
Alexander Sullivan had an interesting take on Patrick Cronin's death.
Not particularly prominent as an Irish nationalist, he may have been murdered by private enemies for private reasons.
His wife, Margaret Sullivan, also had an unusual reaction to not only the murder, but her husband being questioned.
W.B. Yeats, the poet, is hanging out with her when she's in London at the time when her husband is being questioned about the murder. She stays in London. And she goes to the theatre. We know that she goes to the theatre. She's busy, doing other things while there, which I find kind of fascinating.
Aside from Coughlin, who was now in police custody, another detective was working the case. Herman Schutler had gone to O'Sullivan's ice house to ask questions there.
When he goes to the ice house, there is another house beside the ice house. And this house was owned by a family called the Carlsons.
The family had rented the house out, but the man stopped paying rent. So the Carlsons went there and found blood everywhere.
It's very clear there's some property, like furniture that's been broken, clearly there's been a struggle, and that becomes the prosecution case of this is where it happened.
As the police and prosecutors began to determine who was at fault for Patrick Cronin's death, his funeral became an event in the city.
Cronin's funeral takes place in Holy Name Cathedral, even though the bishop is quite firmly friendly with Sullivan. But they sort of have to because of the amount of attention. So he goes from someone who, a handful of people knew, he was known for a good song, to having the largest sort of funeral cortege to go through Chicago since Lincoln, which is just bonkers to think of.
12,000 people filed past the coffin, held at the First Cavalry Armory on Michigan Avenue. Another 40,000 mourners lined the streets as a massive procession followed a horse-drawn carriage to Holy Name Cathedral. Thousands of people continued on, going to a suburb of Chicago, Evanston, where Cronin was buried.
I think it's this perfect storm of salaciousness, of gossipiness, of anti-corruption, of pro and anti-Irish things, and just sort of people want to be there because it becomes a thing to go to. There's drawings of Michigan Avenue just thronged with people for this man that until 2 weeks or 3 weeks before, nobody really had heard of.
After the funeral, this spectacle continued. The family who owned the house where Cronin died opened it to the public.
You can then go to Lakeview and you can go and see the house where he was murdered, and you can buy a souvenir shard of bloody wood to take home with you if you wanted a souvenir. Now, they sold so much bloody wood that they could have built the cottage several times over. So whatever blood you were getting, it wasn't Cronin's on it. And you could come back by the sewer. You could do basically a Cronin murder tour, should you have been so inclined.
But it wasn't enough for the seemingly insatiable appetite of the public.
At the start of the trial, on the very first day, there are thousands turn up to try and get into the courthouse. It takes them weeks, first of all, to get a jury together, because one of the questions you're asked if you're going to be a juror is, have you got an opinion? And pretty much everyone says, oh yeah, I do. He's guilty or he's innocent or whatever. So it takes them, they go through 1,000 potential jurors before they get 12 people who say, yeah, I prepared to listen to this and make a decision based on the evidence, which is I think at the time, the single longest jury selection process in the States. Possibly still, who knows?
5 men were tried for a conspiracy to murder Patrick Henry Cronin. The ice house owner, Patrick O'Sullivan, the policeman, Dan Coughlin, Martin Burke, who rented the home where the murder likely took place, John Beggs, a lawyer who was the senior guardian of Sullivan's camp at Clonagale, and a 5th man, John Coons.
Poor John Coons is just carried along in the midst of this. He's identified as having been involved, but he does look, according to contemporary witnesses, extremely like another man called Andy Foy. And Andy Foy was probably involved. I mean, there's considerable evidence to suggest that Andy Foy probably actually hit Cronin, the fatal blow, but he doesn't get tried.
Alexander Sullivan was also not tried, but in a way, he was found guilty.
His reputation is massively damaged because the public condemn him, even though he's never taken to any court on it. But definitely the Chicago public think it was Sullivan who was behind it.
Sullivan and his wife Margaret paid the legal fees for the men on trial.
I don't think Sullivan murdered him. There's no evidence of that. But where it gets complicated is whether or not he knew or approved of it. I think it's a very strong chance that he didn't, but knew that they did it for him. And so, was prepared to support them in some way as a result of that.
The conspiracy was laid out in court. The group wanted to silence Cronin and lured him to his death under the pretense of helping someone at O'Sullivan's ice house.
He had been bludgeoned to death with something sharp to the head. And obviously the clothes had been taken. whatever had happened in the plan to dump him into Lake Michigan had gone awry, and so they decided to dump him in the sewer instead.
Much like the rumors about his disappearance, there were now rumors about why he'd been stripped naked, and they involved sending his clothes to England.
One of the rumours that they had was that a body would be found of a similar shape and size, and that they would dress this body and then they would dump it in the Thames in London, where that body would disintegrate, but that body would be wearing Cronin's clothes.
It would then be assumed that Cronin was a spy who had escaped to London, where he'd been killed. But prosecutors had another, simpler idea of why he was naked.
To take away anything that would identify him seems to be the only reason to do so. I guess they thought that if he wasn't found, there wouldn't be any way of identifying the body.
The jury debated for 3 days before coming back with a verdict.
Beggs is acquitted, the lawyer is acquitted, Coombs gets 4 years, and the Iceman, O'Sullivan, the policeman, Coughlin, and Martin Birkup, they all get life. And this outrages the Chicago public, who had wanted death penalties. There are photographs of the three men who get the life sentences in their striped uniforms, and they get sent off to Joliet. And that you would think probably was that, except obviously it's never so simple.
Burke and O'Sullivan died of TB in prison. Coombs got a new trial and was acquitted, and Coughlin was also granted a new trial. The former policeman was also acquitted.
He ends up opening a bar in Chicago, and he gets done for witness tampering and a number of other crimes after that, and he goes on the run. And he ends up in Honduras running a banana plantation, where he dies in 1909 of TB.
Alexander Sullivan didn't go to prison, but his life never went back to the way it had been.
His reputation essentially is destroyed. He disappears largely. I mean, he goes entirely quiet for a number of years. He eventually sort of reappears at sort of Irish-American picnics, but very much low-key. Margaret Sullivan continues to have a very stellar literary career. She continues writing. She writes a lot for Catholic publications. She travels to Ireland. She's quite well known at the time. Her career continues quite merrily, and she stays with him. Well, I mean, that's not that surprising, that period, and maybe they were very happy.
Alexander Sullivan died in 1913 at age 66 of natural causes. He had continued to have legal issues, including an additional shooting in the years that followed Cronin's death. He was a close friend of President Benjamin Harrison and was, reportedly, in consideration for the vice presidential slot in Harrison's last campaign. Aside from Dr. Cronin, there was another victim of the murder, Clan na Gael.
For a whole generation, basically, that murder impacts the ability of Irish Republicans to raise money in America. And I think that's partly because in the United States, it was sort of, well, it's okay if they're raising money and sending it back to fight in London or Dublin. But if they're going to take their fights to the sewers of Chicago and there's bloodshed in the States, well, we're not really happy with that.
26 of Ireland's counties became a free state in 1922, becoming the Republic of Ireland in 1948. The northern 6 counties remain a part of the United Kingdom. The case of Dr. Patrick Henry Cronin, though a massive story in its time and inexorably tied to the fate of his home country, faded from the headlines before Ireland was free. What do you think about this case? Please comment below. And if you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like and notification buttons, and let us know if there are cases you'd like us to cover.